Thanks, Ruth. Welcome, everyone. Welcome again to the Centre of Yoga Studies for our last main lecture of the year. So that's kind of it's a great one to finish on, I think. We do, of course, have both our summer school and our postgraduate student conference coming up in a week or two. But before then, we have Laura von Ostrowski coming today to talk to us about contemporary yoga practice and philosophy. Now, I'm going to read you her bio first. Laura von Ostrowski studied Indology and Religious Studies at LMU Munich and received her PhD in Religious Studies from LMU. From 2015 to 2018, she was a fellow of the German Research Foundation's training group Presence and Implicit Knowledge at FAU Erlangen-Nuremberg. Now, that's really interesting to me because this whole thing about presence and implicit knowledge and philosophy and contemporary practice, I think, is really fascinating. And that's why I'm very happy to have Laura here today. We probably actually met at the first Krakow conference in 2016, but there was so much going on at that conference, neither of us really remember that. But there aren't many people who are really working on kind of trying to break new ground in the investigation of embodied contemporary practice as something more than physical, and particularly something philosophical. And I think the wider question here is how we can successfully capture, assess, and do justice to the experiences of practitioners who gain soteriological benefits and ontological insight from their practice. And I think that's why this work is so exciting. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm looking forward also, hopefully, to geeking out in Krakow again next year. And I'm very happy to be able to bring some really quite cutting edge research for you tonight. And I'm going to hand over as quickly as possible to Laura to begin.
Thank you, Theo. Do you hear me well? Yeah, thanks for this very kind introduction and for the invitation. And I'm very happy and actually very excited to be here and to be able to present my research on yoga philosophy in the German and global Ashtanga yoga scene to an international audience. I will now share my screen with you, and I hope you will see my slides coming in. Great. So it's also very exciting for me to have this international audience here and some researchers, peers, because I did not conduct comparative research. I am also curious, thus, how my approach and my results might be interesting for similar studies and in other countries and yoga styles. Oh, I think you, okay. This talk is divided into three main complexes. Right. I will first present a working definition of what I call contemporary yoga philosophy, which helped me to systematize more general differences between late modern interpretations of yoga philosophy and the philosophy of the Patañjali Yoga Shastra. I will argue that the physical practices called yoga have an increasing impact on how yoga philosophy is understood in the 21st century, at least in certain surroundings. I will then outline a brief sketch on the history of yoga philosophy in Ashtanga yoga, or can also call it Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga. I only call it Ashtanga yoga today. My research shows that both Tirumalai Krishnamacharya and his student Patabi Joyce, the founder of Ashtanga Yoga, understood physical yoga mainly as a preparation and not as a spiritual or philosophical practice per se. The opinion that the physical practice helps to experience what is called yoga philosophy grew only in the last decades through exchanges with a growing number of Western practitioners. I will then present a theoretical approach to research such a body-inclusive version of CYP, Contemporary Yoga Philosophy. I will just give you the short acronym in the following, by analyzing an example from my empirical research. So it's going to be a dense talk. To begin with, I want to introduce you to my research field and my empirical data. I conducted my empirical research with the help of participant observation and qualitative interviews between 2015 and 2019, mainly in the German, but also in the global Ashtanga Yoga community, especially among teachers who are, and this is very important to keep in mind for the following, teachers who are not certified by the Joyce family and have just thus left the lineage to a certain degree. These teachers are often more actively exchanging with the broader yoga community. My research question was, one of several research questions I had, the main research question was, how yoga philosophy with focus on the Yogasūtra, this popular 4th, 5th century yoga text attributed to an author called Patañjali, is taught and interpreted in the 21st century in such yoga communities. I wanted to know what characterizes yoga philosophy nowadays and how this phenomenon is related to the physical practice called yoga. In my field, I came to differentiate Yogasūtra experts and Yogasūtra students. Yogasūtra experts in the middle are teachers who explicitly teach the Yogasūtra or more broadly yoga philosophy in teacher trainings or workshops and earn money with this work. Through the globality of Ashtanga Yoga, not only one but different teachers have influence on how students understand the Yogasūtra. Such Yogasūtra students might be engaging since years with the text or are just beginning to engage with it. Most of the times they are not yet teaching the text, even if this is also possible. That their student status does nevertheless not imply that they do not participate in the interpretation of the text. On the contrary, they are often encouraged by the experts to generate their own interpretations. Nevertheless, my research shows that the interpretation of these students are shaped and must be shaped by the explanations of experts, especially due to the lack of Sanskrit knowledge. But also most of the experts in the field, somehow my slide just skipped. Okay, but also most of the experts in my field were not solid in Sanskrit, and both experts and students were influenced by the broader yoga philosophy discourse, which you see at the beginning of my arrow. This discourse was mainly shaped by the influential 20th century yoga teachers and their well-known publications, such as B.K.S. Iyengar's Light on the Yogasūtra of Patañjali from 1993, Desikachar's Yogasūtra translation and commentary, but also several German translations. This means that what is about to develop as yoga philosophy today stands itself in a certain kind of modern lineage of interpretations, which started in the late 19th century with Swami Vivekananda. I will come back to him later, and is, even if it is related to it, to be distinguished from the intellectual commentary tradition that is associated with the Patañjali Yoga Shastra. As for the Yogasūtra experts, I conducted qualitative interviews with several students of the founder of Ashtanga Yoga, Patañjali. I interviewed John Scott, Greg Nardi, Gregor Mähle, and for the German field, the medical doctor Ronald Steiner. As all those Ashtanga Yoga experts lost their authorization by the Joyce family, this allows them also to break with the strict orthopraxy. Many of them, like Steiner, Nardi, and Mähle, modify the practice of Ashtanga Yoga and include other practices, which, as we will see, might also have an influence on the related belief systems. I also interviewed Karen Ryan, which some of you might know, who gave me valuable insights into the teachings of Patabi Joyce, but as she's not actively teaching in the Ashtanga Yoga scene anymore, I do not include her in this expert category. Apart from these more global expert interviews, most of my empirical research took place in one of Steiner's advanced teacher trainings. To investigate the so far fully neglected reception side, the position of the students, I further interviewed 4 of Steiner's apprentices, David, Karen, Peter, and Hannah, all pseudonyms. I analyzed also yoga philosophy homeworks that 10 other students of the teacher training kindly provided to me. and generated 35 hours of audio recordings of philosophy sessions in the teacher training, which I evaluated in for my research questions relevant parts. Of course, all of this took place with the consent of the group. To also keep an eye on the effect of the physical practices, which were the biggest part of the training, I took field notes in a diary about my own experiences with the modified Ashtanga Yoga practice that Steiner taught. This experimental setting that you see here of my empirical research has generated some basic insights. In her important book, The History of Modern Yoga from 2004, Elizabeth de Michelis interpreted Joyce's Ashtanga Yoga as a paradigmatic form of modern postural yoga, about which she writes, "The doctrinal aspects of the teaching are mostly rudimentary, the general underlying assumption being that understanding will come through first-hand experience rather than from intellectual deliberation. As in Vivekananda's Raja Yoga, the key epistemological presuppositions are experiential here, and practitioners are mostly left to make sense of the received theories and practices and of how these should be fitted into their lives on the basis of their own rationalizations. The latter, as fieldwork data show, are generally shaped by the religio-philosophical assumptions characteristic of New Age religion. Compared to this account, my data shows that since the Michelis research, thus in the course of the still young 21st century, religio-philosophical motivations must have increased in the yoga scene, despite the unchanged prevalence of body practices. This means that what David Gordon White only briefly touches upon in the last pages of his book, The Yogasūtra of Patañjali, a biography, a phenomenon which he calls Yogasūtra 2.0, is in a very dynamic process of development and is increasingly shaping what yoga is today. I thus developed a working definition of what I came to call contemporary yoga philosophy to be able to distinguish it from classical yoga philosophy. This permits to not see today's takes on the text only as a continuation of the ancient Indian Yogasūtra tradition, as it is sometimes presented in the yoga scene, but to make the process of change visible that has taken place in the last decades. Based on my empirical data and a loose connection to existing research, I developed 6 characteristics of what is called yoga philosophy today. They are: first, synthesis of different Indian and non-Indian worldviews. Breaking with the textual tradition, selection and expansion, orientation to the everyday life, Sanskrit and chanting, and practice orientation. The first 3 have historical roots, even if they are further elaborated in the 21st century. Increasingly so by a globally connected community and after the death of the influential Indian yoga teachers like Patañjali. The last 3 are significant for the global yoga community in the 21st century. So I will go them through step by step now. The first one, synthesis, highlights that in what is called yoga philosophy, various Indian yoga texts and to some extent scriptures from other religious traditions and worldviews have been and continue to be synthesized. Synthesis already shapes the late 19th century works of Manilal Dwivedi and Swami Vivekananda and will become further apparent in the work of Krishnamacharya, Patabi Joyce, and in Iyengar's exposition of yoga philosophy, who, as de Michelis has shown, influentially connected it with New Age concepts. For synthesis, the Yogasūtra acts as an umbrella reference point. For example, introduces the reception of the Yogasūtra, the famous Ashtangas, the 8 limbs, to CYP. But through the inclusion of other ancient Indian texts that are studied in teacher trainings, like the Bhagavad Gita, some Upanishads, and Hatha Yoga texts, devotional and monistic worldviews are an integral part of modern and contemporary yoga philosophy. It may also include energy concepts of Hatha Yoga, such as the nadis, kundalini, chakras, and so on. And the same holds true for the important Indian devotional bhakti tradition, mainly deriving from the reception of the Bhagavad Gita, which is also a common reading in yoga teacher trainings and in my research field. Synthesis in relation to the Yogasūtra has a historical basis. As David Gordon White emphasized, there has been a South Indian Yogasūtra revival between the 16th to the 18th century. In this context, the text, arguably, as White says, in the wake of the last influential Yogasūtra commentator, the 15th century Advaita Vedantin Vijnana Bhikshu, the text was effectively removed from its spiritual historical roots and associated with the monistic Advaita Vedanta and energy concept-based Hatha Yoga, as also Seth Powell has emphasized. Today's yoga philosophy is rooted in those syncretic Yogasūtra interpretations, which were common in India and from the 19th century onwards, are increasingly based on cross-cultural transfer. Synthesis takes on new dimensions in the 21st century in the hands of Western interpreters. Through the contact with modernity, what is called yoga philosophy came to include many more movements and thought systems. In my data, for example, I found more or less explicit and elaborate takes on the following ones: the holism of the early 20th century physical culture movement, New Age, American transcendentalism, modern mindfulness, positive psychology, and many more. The second characteristic, breaking with the textual tradition, describes the lack of reception and inclusion of the Yoga Bhashya, the oldest commentary on the Yogasūtra, as well as of the following authoritative commentaries of Vachaspati Mishra, Vijnana Bhikshu, and others. Because the Yoga Bhashya was also not part of the yoga philosophy teachings in my research field, in the following I will only refer to the Yogasūtra and not to the Patañjali Yoga Shastra when I'm talking about my empirical data. This breaking away from the intellectual commentary tradition of the sutra led to the development of a modern self-commentary tradition. As many of you know, it starts influentially with Swami Vivekananda, who in his 1896 published book, Vedanta Philosophy, Lectures on Raja Yoga and Other Subjects, not only provided a translation of the Yogasūtra, but, and this is very important, an own commentary to the Yogasūtra. By making use of this traditionally so important literary format of philosophical India, Vivekananda ascribes authenticity to his own interpretation and establishes at the same time a new kind of non-traditional format of commentary that continues to this day. In this new type of commentary, authors only refer loosely to the textual tradition, like Yoga Bhashya and so on, and make use of this different syncretism that do not stem from the Yoga Darshana tradition and often from no Indian tradition at all. A usual approach of the later globally influential BKS Iyengar and common in CYP. Through increasing Indological expertise in the field, of course, the Bhashya is slowly coming back, but is mainly still unnoticed, which is surely going to change in the next years. Also, the third characteristic has a direct link to the history of yoga. I call it selection as well as expansion of contents. Selection refers to the historical and still predominant approach to the Yogasūtra to omit certain parts of the text, while only selecting and focusing on a few. For example, for a long time, the focus was mainly on the Ashtanga section of the second pada, and the Siddhi section in the third chapter, for example, was totally excluded. This has been the case throughout the 20th century, and we also find a selection in Krishnamacharyya's early works, like the Yoga Makaranda from 1934, where the author focuses on the Ashtangas and fully omits other contents. But in the 21st century, more and more parts of the text are being received, probably due to the nowadays good popularity of the Ashtangas and the desire for more content. In the teacher training where I conducted my research, the first 3 chapters of the text were discussed sutra by sutra, and a new trend of expansion is becoming apparent. Since BKS Iyengar, none of the teachers, except BKS Iyengar, none of the teachers of the Krishnamacharya lineage left a written discussion of the Yogasūtra in its full length. The practitioners in my field interpret these new parts of the text with a comparative approach, with the help of many different translations and also based on their own interpretations. The tendency of expansion in the 21st century is thus a good basis for the 4th characteristic, which I call orientation to daily life. All in all, interpretations that are suitable, interpretations of the Yogasūtra, of course, that are suitable for everyday life are prevalent, because today's yoga philosophy has often as a prerequisite that it can be lived in the here and now. Karen, a student of Steiner, replied, for example, to my question in an interview whether the Yogasūtra was part of her everyday life. Completely. Not that I integrate the complete sutra into my complete life, but certain statements that are important to me have become a way of life. It is completely integrated into my everyday life. I also try to communicate this both to my children, and sometimes I'm also philosophizing with my environment a lot. All translations by me. That Karen connects the Yogasūtra so intensely with her life is related to the fact that her teacher Steiner emphasized to do so repeatedly in his philosophy lessons. Also, Greg Nardi told me, I encourage my students not necessarily to discard the Yogasūtras, but that they should consider how does this apply more to their own lives, and if this is something that is useful for them. As Nardi's statement implies, this premise often leads to a process of decontextualization. Individual sutras are detached from their worldview context and placed in a new life world context. Since most of the recipients are shaped by everyday life in a prosperous society in the 21st century, sutras can take on a completely new meaning through the focus on everyday life. For reasons of time, I cannot say too much about this 5th characteristic, Sanskrit and chanting. But while to my knowledge, neither Krishnamacharya nor Joyce taught Sanskrit to their Western students, it becomes an increasing part of the curriculum of Ashtanga Yoga teacher trainings and is often taught, for example, in my field by Germans or by Americans, but not by Indians. Next to Sanskrit lessons, emphasis is mainly placed on a meditative effect of Sanskrit chants and chanting the Yogasūtra, which was a daily practice in Steiner's teacher trainings. This is increasingly developing into a practice, form of practice alongside physical practice as a way to experimentally approaching the contents discovered in the Yogasūtra. It thus also becomes a way to practice philosophy. Sanskrit, but also English mantras, Sanskrit and English mantras have also a firm place and contribute to the holistic and monistic color of the worldview of CYP through their often Vedantic origin. Now I come to the last of my categories, practice orientation, and this shall be the focus of the rest of the talk, because the physical asana-based practice is important for the yoga philosophy, was very important for the yoga philosophy in my research field in 2 ways. First, the psychophysical experiences and states that arise from the yoga practice on the mat, as well, of course, as from pranayama, meditation, and mantra chanting, are a crucial factor in understanding the context of content of yoga philosophy. This is a nexus that Krishnamacharya and Joyce, for example, did not teach directly. Still, as I realized in the course of my research, many contents of yoga philosophy in my research field cannot be analyzed and understood without an additional consideration of the respective practices. Second, contemporary yoga philosophy is also a phenomenon that narratively frames and influences the bodily practices called yoga, in that its contents influence, for example, practice quantity or practice quality. To practice quality, I will say more in a third part of this talk. And for an example, now how sutra interpretations in my research data influence the quantity of practice, I give you the first phrase of the Yogasūtra, Atha Yoganushasanam. While in the exegetical tradition of the text, the sentence primarily takes on some text opening rather than a content-related function. In my research field, the Sanskrit word atha, now, can also be translated differently, but here in my field translated as now, initiates a regular yoga practice on the mat. It stands for the discipline needed to get on the yoga mat and is very important for the students. For example, in the understanding of trainee Charlotte, there's also a call in there. Atha is always now. It also says that yoga is a discipline, a pleasant one. That Joyce ignores this sutra completely in his Yoga Mala is one of many signs for an interpretative shift in yoga philosophy from the 20th to the 21st century. While all 6 aspects were relevant to my field of research in other yoga styles and communities, there might be more emphasis on some and less on others, or some might not be relevant at all. As I said, they were mainly derived from my data. Still, I found the first 3 more historical characteristics mentioned by Singleton in his article, Classical Reveries of Modern Yoga from 2008. And all 6 aspects are confirmed in Susanne Scholl's article from 2017, in which she analyzes a recent American Yogasūtra translation by Barbara Stoller-Miller, together with some other examples. So I'm very curious how they might apply to other yoga schools. So, as this was the focus of my research, I will in the following elaborate on this, only on this 6th characteristic, the conjunction of yoga philosophy with the physical practice called yoga and the body. I will put this first into a bigger historical context, and I will have a look with you at the take on yoga philosophy in the Krishnamacharya lineage. I will focus on the today prevalent opinion that the Ashtanga Yoga practice itself is a philosophical practice that will lead to the higher states of consciousness the Yogasūtra enumerates in the sections of the Ashtanga, the inner limbs. And this opinion is solidified in Joyce's famous saying, this is Patañjali Yoga. So he talks about this, the Ashtanga Yoga practice is Patañjali Yoga. Following this direction, Ronald Steiner writes on his homepage, the physical practice of Ashtanga Yoga is understood as a commentary on the philosophy it contains. Based on one's own experience, this allows for a direct access to the philosophical contents, which at first seem abstract. For every single sentence of the sutra, there is an equivalent in practice. I nevertheless argue, at least this is what I found out in my historical research, that it was not Krishnamacharya's nor Joyce's opinion that the asana practice itself is a spiritual practice. The spiritualization of Ashtanga Yoga was developed by the growing international community and is still in process of development. When I now talk about Krishnamacharya, I will only focus on the relation of asana and yoga philosophy in Krishnamacharya's work and teachings in his time at the Mysore Palace from 1933 to 1952, because this was the time when Joyce and Iyengar, that were relevant to my field, were under his tutelage. And even if Krishnamacharya taught the Yogasūtra in detail from the 1950s on in his time in Chennai to later students like his son Desikachar or A.G. Mohan, he did not do so in his time in Mysore, as other researchers have pointed out before me. So Mark Singleton, for example, had suggested concerning the relation between physical yoga practice and the Yogasūtra that Krishnamacharya's work was a modern project of grafting gymnastic or aerobic asana practice onto the Yogasūtras and the creation of a new tradition. Jason Birch's newer research has nevertheless shown that from the 17th century onwards, several large yoga compilations which integrated teachings of Hatha and Raja Yoga with those of Patañjali Yoga and Brahmanical text were written. Similar to Krishnamacharya's publications, those texts referenced to Patanjali mainly allude to the Ashtangas. Still, in his important work, somehow I have a little problem, I'm sorry, with my slide here. It somehow jumps. I cannot tell you why, but I'm back. Still in his important work, Yoga Makaranda from 1934, the last four angas, pratyahara, withdrawal of senses, dharana, concentration, dhyana, meditation, and samadhi, absorption, are nearly non-existent. In the Makaranda, but also in his other texts from the 1930s, 1940s, the Yoga Sanagalu and the Yoga Makaranda too, Krishnamacharya stresses that the angas are meant to work like a ladder to be climbed up step by step, which means, this is what he writes, that profound and constant meditation follows only after ethical observations and physical practices have been accomplished. In his Yoga Sanagalu, written in the 1940s, Krishnamacharya even states that the last anga, starting with pratyahara, should be learned from respective teachers. In his time at the Mysore Palace, Krishnamacharya does not have been this teacher. His early student, T.R.S. Sharma, stated that the spiritual aspects of yoga like dhyana, dharana, and the samadhi states were rarely talked about. And B.K.S. Iyengar remarks of his asana regime prepared by Krishnamacharya, if my brother-in-law also had an eye to my deeper spiritual or personal development, he did not say so at the time. The only statement that I found about an early philosophical teaching during this period stems from Pattabhi Jois, who studied with Krishnamacharya between 1927 and 1953. Jois remembers about his teacher in an interview from Alexander Medin. He would usually teach us for 1 or 2 hours every day, asanas early in the morning and around 12 o'clock philosophy class. He also taught us pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, and dhyana. And in addition to the Yogasūtras and Bhagavad Gita, he also taught Yoga Vasishta, Yoga Yajnavalkya, and Samhita, and all in Sanskrit. But Jois also mentions that within these 25 years of studies with Krishnamacharya, he only received those philosophy teachings in the period of 5 years. He mentions that in the same interview. This is thus a very different approach than today, where yoga philosophy comes in early, as it is part of yoga lessons, workshops, and teacher trainings. But even if Pattabhi Jois must have been well acquainted with the Yogasūtra, his long-term students from the 1990s and my interview partners, Mellon, Nali, Scott, and Steiner, also Karen Ryan, told me that they did not receive systematic introduction to yoga philosophy from Jois. He even told his students to not read the Yogasūtra. Eddie Stern and Gita Nahaya write, he told us this was the most important text to read, though he said it was difficult and required much interpretation. Oh, where am I here? Here. So, Jois was, oh, sorry, somehow I'm a bit in advance of my, Okay. Joyce was a follower of the Advaita Vedanta philosophy of Sri Shankara, and for him, the Yogasūtra and its Ashtangas required much interpretation to suit his own worldview, which brings us back to the first and historical characteristic of CYP's synthesis. Donahaya remembers, Guruji maintained that the internal limbs, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi are Advaita insofar as they concern the non-dualistic state, the experience of the self, which is none other than God. That Joyce didn't think that the meditational limbs were laid out in the asana practice itself is also highlighted by Singleton, who refers to an anonymous report of a Mysore resident who studied under Joyce in the 1960s. Singleton writes that the name Ashtanga Vinyasa was applied to the system only after the arrival of the first American students in the 1970s. Prior to this, Joyce had simply referred to his teaching as asana. Still, Joyce's later students were searching for an underlying philosophical basis to their body practice called Ashtanga Yoga, which was, as Eddie Stern writes, not such an easy undertaking. One thing that set Pattabhi Joy's teachings apart from other yoga communities that had made their way westwards and which made the quest for information all the more challenging was a lack of literature. B.K.S. Iyengar had written Light on Yoga, Paramahamsa Yogananda penned Autobiography of a Yogi, and Swami Vishnu Devananda had the complete illustrated book of yoga. We only had the first-hand experience of Pattabhi Joy's few English words and his fearsome hands that put us into positions we would otherwise have chosen not to attempt. Pattabhi Joy's instructions, therefore, became something of a treasure hunt. Only as late as 1999, Joyce's book Yoga Mala was published in English. As my interviews suggest, Joyce's disciples had to initiate the introduction to the Yogasūtra themselves. Nadi remembers, I've over the years taken courses with this one or that one. I've gotten, I would say, at least 3 different teachers who I've sat through a course on the Yogasūtras with. To Mele, the Yogasūtra was recommended by a Persian mystic, as he told me, already at the age of 15. Mele told me in the interview, I got my first copy of this Sutra then and have studied it ever since, long time before he met Pattabhi Joyce. But he clarified that Joyce did not teach the sutra to him. John Scott was not introduced to the text formally until he started his own teacher trainings, whereas Steiner's mother was already a yoga teacher and he was interested in the Yogasūtra long before his first trip to India. All these examples show that when it comes to yoga philosophy, Pattabhi Joy was not a mediator between the teachings of Krishnamacharya and the Western disciples, but he interrupted a possible transfer. They also point out that since a few decades, the Yogasūtra is a globalized, exotic research, to say it with Veronique Altglas. Now we make a little jump after I introduced you to a little historical basis, because what actually interested me then for the big part of my research is how can one research this already discussed nexus of yoga philosophy and the practice of Ashtanga Yoga, even if it might be a contemporary one. What I have to say before I go into this somehow theoretical approach and an example of my research here, I have to emphasize that this nexus of yoga and philosophy is not popularized by all of my interviewed experts. Gregor Merle still wrote in his famous book from 2006 about Ashtanga Yoga and Patañjali Yoga that in ancient times, what are today regarded as 2 systems that only share the same name, the Ashtanga Yoga of Patañjali and the Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga of the Rishi Vamana, were in fact one. Mele has now moved away from the view of the congruency of these 2 systems and calls Joyce's Ashtanga Yoga now Ekanga Yoga, one-limbed yoga, because it is, in his opinion, it only focuses on the third limb of the Ashtanga asana. So I was mainly then interested, after this big historical part, in the body, and I further investigated this nexus of practice and philosophy that Steiner and also Nadi taught, and asked myself, how do the concrete body practices carried out in the research field, like Ashtanga Yoga and its modifications, influence the interpretation of the Yogasūtra? And how do, on the other hand, Yogasūtra interpretations influence the body? To research this nexus on a meta level, I found a suiting theory in the framework of aesthetics of religion. And in the light of an aesthetics of religion approach, practices are seen to affect senses, to change bodies, and via bodies, cognition. I define then body knowledge as the explicit and implicit psychosomatic change to which regular yoga practice leads. Body knowledge has an influence, as my research shows, on possible spaces of experience and also conditions the hermeneutic scope of meaning of certain concepts of the Yogasūtra. Departing from a variety of interdisciplinary knowledge resources on embodiment, aesthetics of religion scholar Anne Koch has established a concept to talk about an aesthetic embodied effect in the context of cultural studies and the anthropology of religion, and she provides 7 body knowledge categories. They are usable as meta language for implicit embodied processes, which usually don't translate into language, into express language. These categories are body scheme, thermoregulation, covered imitation, tattooing, muscle tone, posture and movement, prosthetic perception, and peripersonal space. And for the analysis of my data, I added the categories body image flow, extraordinary states of consciousness, proprioception, and breath. With the help of these categories, I investigated this relationship between body practices called yoga and Yogasūtra interpretations from another angle, from the side of the body. The aesthetics of religion approach is highly interdisciplinary and allows to include studies from neuroscience, for example, on yoga, movement, and breath, which I worked myself through, and allows to include them in a social cultural analysis. So after this little theoretical introduction, let me elaborate this approach very concretely on one example from my data, the interpretation of the famous Sutra 246, Sthira Sukham Asanam. The sutra is translated by the Indologist Edwin Bryant as posture should be steady and comfortable, and was originally likely referring to a stable seated meditation posture. My fieldwork suggests that this verse is understood as a guide to a balanced body tone during the dynamic movement practice of Ashtanga Yoga, and can thus be researched in consideration of Koch's body knowledge category, muscle tone, posture, and movement. The others I will not talk about today. I have that in my book. The interview excerpt of the yoga teacher David shows that for him, as for many others in my field, Sutra 246 takes on a holistic, body-inclusive, daily life focus and organizes muscle tone via its influence on the quality of movement. And I think I try to hold, this is David, every asana in such a way that it is as stable as possible, and if it's not joyful, sukha, then it is an asana that I'm doing incorrectly, or an asana is still too much for me. That's why I always take a step back very quickly, and I think that's how I never go beyond my own limits, even in Ashtanga Yoga. And this is how I have also learned to respect my own limits in life. That I know, okay, I have limits, and I can of course also test them again and again. and perhaps also sometimes push and expand my own limits, but not as I've done before in my life, just mercilessly stepped over my limits without ifs and buts. To say it with the sociologist Irving Goffman, the sutra serves as a frame for the physical practice. According to Goffman, framing is an interpretation scheme that organizes daily life experiences. David's explanations show that the Yogasūtra can become such a frame, or as I develop in an upcoming article on yoga and the modern Israeli dance Gaga, which I wrote together with dance researcher Lina Aschenbrenner, the sutra turns into an experience filter for yoga practices as well as for daily life. David filters his practice experiences with Sutra 246 and does in a certain way practice the sutra. The sutra gives David a direction how to practice yoga, and this changes how his practice becomes effective for him and his body. I will come to an end soon. Just another little take on this analysis of Sutra 246. On the other way around, the interpretation of Sutra 246 as a well-balanced tension during movement practice can only become effective and a real embodied experience because David knew tools to modify his Ashtanga Yoga practice in a way that created this balanced state between muscular strength and volition on the one hand, and muscular and mental relaxation on the other. In this example, philosophy and practice are shaping each other. The psychosomatic effects that are resulting from the integration of Sutra 246 into modern practices are also perceived, discussed, and systematized by neurological studies on yoga, like the one of Schmalzl, Power, and Henje Blom from 2015. Even if they don't mention Sutra 246 directly, they surely refer to it and show how deeply this interpretation that I've just shown influences today's yoga and turns it into what it is. The authors write, lastly, yoga-based movement is practiced with the intent of obtaining a balanced muscle tone that allows the movement to feel stable and well-rooted, yet light and effortless. While individual postures or parts of the practice may be characterized by a hypertonic or hypotonic state, the overall aim of the practice is to create a state of eutonia or well-balanced tension, Alexander, 1985. Interestingly, the concept of eutonia used by Schmalzl and et al. Was coined by the named physical culturist Gerda Alexander in the 1920s, whom they also refer to, as you can see in the end of the quote. This shows that through the interpretation of Sutra 246 as a balanced muscle tone during movement, also states thought by the physical culture movement and even concrete concepts infiltrate today's asana praxis, which highlights another modern aspect of synthesis. Through such filters provided by the content of yoga philosophy, okay, I have to find another way to have my slides here. Through such filters provided by the content of contemporary yoga philosophy, body therapeutic motivations and themes similar to those of the physical culture movement influence today's yoga practice and are even partly provided with its vocabulary, eutonia. I do this in my upcoming book in German, but I cannot go into more detail on what Patañjali might have thought about this interpretation of Sutra 246, but you all possibly have read Philip Ma's very informative article on this, which I can recommend. I don't have much time for conclusion, actually not really time anymore, even if there would be a lot to reflect on, for example, the issue also of cultural appropriation, which I shortly deal with in my thesis and much more. I will just add, if you let me these 2-3 minutes, a few last thoughts.
There's no rush, Laura, there's no rush, take your time, you're fine.
Thanks, dear. Okay, so I will only add a few last thoughts and leave the rest to the discussion. My research shows that even if contemporary yoga philosophy is not congruent with classical yoga philosophy, having developed through cross-cultural exchange in the 20th century and further in the 21st century, it must not be overlooked that it became an important and effective part of what yoga is today. And the version of CYP that I could work out in my empirical data goes further than White's observation, who writes about the Yogasūtra, and especially about today's current practice of reciting the text in Sanskrit. It's truth. And by extension, the authenticity of their own yoga practice lies in the simple fact that it exists. He talks about the Yogasūtra, and that its words are there, recoverable across space and time through the simple act of performance. For many of my friends in the yoga subculture, this is a source of solace and inspiration. In my research field, as I could possibly hopefully show, the engagement with the text is much more than a source of solace and inspiration. The discourse of practicing the text influences the yoga practice quantitatively, with the first sutra that I've shown, for example, but as I've just shown, also qualitatively, and renders it into a unique way to move. Contemporary yoga philosophy shapes, through its close connection with the body practice, bodies, minds, and emotions. It changes muscle tone. Muscle tone is highly connected with emotions, of course, as all of us know. Breathing patterns, body images, and body schemes, proprioception, and much more. It contributes to a practice that is generated by and tailored to modernity. And in my research field, and surely in many other cases, contemporary yoga philosophy renders physical practice, physical yoga, into what it is and distinguishes it from other forms of movement. At least this is my theory. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion with all of you. And sorry for my jumping slides that you didn't see, but I didn't see them anymore.
No, it was all very smooth at our end, don't worry. Thank you. As beautiful as this slide is, perhaps you probably should stop sharing the screen, and then people can see you instead. Although that is a gorgeous Murti.
Am I back? Yeah.
All right, so just to remind everyone, I know we've got some questions coming in already, but do go to the Slido, sli.do, and enter the code 460023 to ask questions. But I'm gonna, for once, use my host privilege and ask first question, if that's okay. It's obvious to me this is fascinating research. I'm also aware of how difficult it can be to take what is such a complex picture and kind of really hone it to these apparently simple schemas of, you know, these are the 6 points and these are the three types of this and so on, and how difficult it can be to do that. So I want to recognize how much work that is to begin with. And there's so much we could talk about, but I want to, what really struck me is this concept of the sutras as experience filters. And I'd be really interested to read that article that you've co-written. And I guess I'm wondering about, first of all, how much you were or weren't influenced by the concepts of habitus when thinking about experience filters, and how ingrained or evolving those filters can be, I guess. My secondary part to that is, I guess it throws new light on something for me, which is filters for experience, of course, are filters for perception. And I'm wondering if the sutras of the philosophy filters the experience of the practice in a certain way, how does this help to explain the pushback against kind of the knowledge of abuse, for example, by some of these famous teachers, is that then becomes knowledge, which again filters the experience in new ways and therefore changes the experience. And I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about the reception of that knowledge, perhaps.
Yeah, I think your second question was very complex. I will first answer the first one, and then I will get back to the second. Maybe I have to get back with me together on that, because I think I followed you, and it is very fascinating. I think I have something to say on that. So first, habitus and experience filters. So you talk about Bourdieu, and you ask yourself a bit if an experience filter, as a sutra, as I've worked out, can be for the practitioners in my field, if this can be so strong to become a habitus. Did I?
Yeah.
Well, in the article, I mean, my colleague, she did, as I said, research on Gaga, which was extremely interesting. To just plug that here, is that we found out that yoga filters, for example, mindfulness filter, as we name one of them, and others, that yoga filters are also influence other modern movement practices. So she found lots of those yoga filters in Gaga, even if in Gaga there is no theory at all. Gaga doesn't work with any kind of philosophy or anything, just with movement. But the people had yoga filters, which with they interpreted their physical experiences. So that's very interesting. And we don't go as far to say that this becomes a habitus, but there needs to be some research on that. I'm sure it can.
I'm aware. I'm aware in my own data. There was a little tiny moment where I was standing on a festival site, and we were watching people come across the field to a particular movement session that was happening. And the person I was with said, "See, you can tell the yoga teachers and the dance teachers by how they walk across the field to the session." So you could literally tell the two different ways of moving, and the filters through which they moved was really interesting.
I remember that a yoga student said once to his teacher, "Well, do you see how he floats over the court? I mean, he really ingrained all of these teachings completely." It was true. He was like really not walking anymore, he was just floating. So that might be something very deeply embodied that comes out of a certain way of dealing with philosophical contents. And so I hope this answered your question a little bit. I can't say much more about this. And about the abuse, let's say, how did you frame it? That with the filters in my field, they somehow influence the practice. But on the other hand, this knowledge about Patabi Joyce being an abuser, as we all know since a few years, it came directly in my research. Matthew Remsky's book came out, of course. How this also influences the people, and how this might be related, or what was your
I'm wondering if
further point on that?
I'm wondering if that knowledge of abuse in effect becomes an unwanted experience filter that arrives on the practice at that point.
Well, in my research field, actually, because I stopped, I only had the interview with Karen Ryan in 2019, and otherwise I stopped in 2018. The formation was over, interviews were over, so nothing of that was there. But I think that the teachers in my field, those ones who left the lineage, were somehow aware of it without talking about it. And I think that, for example, the extreme focus on proprioception that Steiner employed, and really away from nociception, which was nocioception, extreme, of course, experience field within Patabi Joyce surrounding. I think he implicitly, or he, let's say, silently already turned the experience onto another kind of Ashtanga yoga. So that I guess, this is one thing I can say to that this unwanted filter, would be interesting, but it was not part of my data.
Next project. No.
Yeah, maybe.
I'm sure you've got lots to think about. All right, so I'm not going to monopolize it any longer. I know we've got some great questions coming in. A couple of them anonymous to begin with. The first one then, does Steiner describe in more detail the exact correlation between each sutra and the asanas of the Ashtanga system? Or does he just say there's a correlation?
Yeah. Of the Ashtanga system, that means the Ashtanga Vinyasa.
Vinyasa, yeah.
this is not my rendering of how Sutra and Ashtanga Yoga is related. I quoted Ronald Steiner on this, and I met this several times in the field, that teachers somehow developed this kind of take that the sutras can be practiced, but it was not.
But he didn't systematize it. He didn't teach it in a systematic way.
No, there was really not a systematic way. Well, my thesis right now, I have to shorten it, has 430 pages. So I go through a lot of sutras, not only Sthira Sukhamasanam, but Abhyasa Vairagya, and of course all the Ashtangas and so on. And then I wanted to already write it before this talk, but I didn't. Just so many things to do, but I plan to really write an article for a Journal of Yoga Studies to have some more examples how this connection between sutra interpretations and its interpretations and the asana practice, how they are developed, employed, lived, and then also lived by the students. It is really something that needs to be researched in detail, but it's nothing that I can just say like this. I hope.
Yeah. It's always an interesting thing when a prominent teacher kind of hints at a bigger system, but then doesn't actually lay it out. That's kind of interesting. So next question, another anonymous one. Has the relevance of the Patañjali Yoga Sutras been overemphasized by Western practitioners who are perhaps unwittingly rooted in a largely text-based knowledge tradition? So I guess, is it that sense of Western knowledge being very textual in many ways that's led Western practitioners to really emphasize the Patañjali Yoga Sutras?
Yeah, I'm very sure that that's the case. Mark Singleton also writes on that. I think in his article also in 2008 that I mentioned, but I guess also in his book from 2010 in his last section where he talks about Joyce and Krishnamacharya. But surely I think this search for having a text that lays it all out, that is old and that is authoritative, has surely been a very big, let's say, urge that maybe Western practitioners were not even aware of. And this is one side, I think, of the topic from the side of Western practitioners. But one has to also say, of course, but I mean, this is a long history now, and there's been lots of research on that Vivekananda, Dwivedi, and also other Indian yoga teachers really tried also, in reaction surely to colonialization, try to make the Yoga Sutra such a big text. So they try to emphasize that they also have texts,
Yes,
and this was surely in relation to the very text-based view on, okay, do they have religious sources or not?
Do they have a Bible, basically?
Do they have a Bible? That's it.
Yeah. So it's kind of a pull and a push, isn't it, at that point?
That's really like a ping pong.
Okay, so our own Ruth Westerby has actually a couple of questions. Which one would you like to ask first, Ruth? And you can unmute yourself.
Thank you ever so much. That was fascinating. I really appreciate hearing about your research. It was two questions. You choose whether to answer them and in what order. One was about, love to hear more on your work on cultural appropriation, and then also about the designation Ashtanga Yoga for Pattabhi Jois's lineage, sort of who and when. You mentioned Mark Singleton described the title as having been taken after the arrival of the first American students in the 1970s. I've heard it described to me as a attempt to demark Ashtanga Yoga in association with the Shastra rather than with Hatha Yoga. So it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
So your second question was about the name Ashtanga Yoga. So I know I have this information from Singleton, and also that Pattabhi Jois did not seem to really have taught the Yoga Sutra to his students, is of course another somehow sign that he did not push the Yoga Sutra forward too much. So one wonders if the system is called like this, and this is so important, why did he not really lay it out to his students, why they might be congruent or why the system is called like this? I don't know more about that than what Mark Singleton wrote about this, because all the people that I interviewed, they were with Patañjali in the 1990s. And then, of course, it was what it was. It had the name it had. So, and what you heard was that he wanted to kind of separate it from Hatha Yoga teaching. So he was referring to the Yogasūtra. That makes total sense, because this is also what Krishnamacharya often did. Krishnamacharya in his books talks about Raja Yoga and Hatha Yoga. And of course, he talks about the Hatha Yoga practices and he includes them. And I mean, his whole teaching is based on asana, of course, and other practices, pranayama. But he really wanted to differentiate his teachings from Hatha Yoga, maybe because it had still a very bad reputation at his time. And maybe Patañjali kind of took that over. I'm really cannot say more about this. Yeah, sorry. I mean, that was not my main focus in my research, and I would love to have more informations on that. And yeah, from Patañjali, we cannot get these informations anymore. And can you please remind me of your first question? I forgot to make a little comment, a note on that.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And it was about cultural appropriation. You said you've been doing some work on it.
Yeah, cultural appropriation. Well, that was a difficult one. I just talk about it in my conclusion. And I mean, there are really some sutras that are taking such a daily life focus that one asks, can we do this with an old Indian text? Like, should we have respect for the tradition? And I'm very happy also that much more knowledge is coming upon the way, with many Indologists, of course, that are teaching the Yogasūtra, the Yoga Bhashya, and so on. But on the other hand, we have to see that there were also yoga teachers like B.K.S. Iyengar, who said, and I'm not quoting him because I don't know his exact words, but he said, the Michaelis also writes about that, because these concepts are very difficult, and he names three, I think it's Purusha, Karma, and I don't know the third one anymore. Each man has to understand them according to his own knowledge. So each one has to just interpret them as he wants or she wants. So this is, for example, what B.K.S. Iyengar told his international students in his book, the Yogasūtra of Patañjali, or even in Light on Yoga. I'm not sure in which book he said that. But so Indian gurus also facilitated, of course, this somehow take on the sutra that is daily life, that is decontextualization. And Indian gurus themselves somehow, of course, they stepped on a tradition, as I wanted to show, because even in the centuries before, there was like the dualistic Yoga Sutra was mingled with Advaita, Vedanta, and so on. So there was a certain synthetic tradition that the gurus in the 20th century stepped upon. But somehow what is done today is going a step further. So I think synthesis, mingling a lot of things that now can be deemed as a cultural appropriation, is somehow a basis of the teachings of the gurus of the 20th century. And then one has to really see in detail the, let's say, examples in each field. So what is this? What do we do with this? If it's so far away from the Yogasūtra, maybe one can really talk more about cultural appropriation. But I think that Yogasūtra especially is such a globalized text now that it's really a difficult topic to say something clear about that.
I wonder if there's an interesting question to be asked then about the difference between, as a student, saying I can understand this small thing in relation to this sutra, that is this incredibly profound philosophical thing, and I can understand this small thing, but it's the difference between that and then proclaiming yourself an expert in what that sutra means on the basis of that small kind of limited understanding. And that's, yeah.
I mean, I also interviewed an expert who said, I'm not interested in what Patanjali said. I'm interested in what I read in the Yogasūtra. And clearly said, I'm no Indological who wants to know what Patanjali said, even if he's interested in that too. But then Patanjali cannot be taken so much as a real basis for the practice. So he just decontextualizes it, and then it makes more sense. So I have these really interview pieces too. So, and this, I mean, this is an interesting thing when one talks about cultural appropriation, of course.
Yeah. Yes, not an easy one. Okay, so I know we have one more question from Jared Musica. I'm gonna ask Jared to unmute himself. Hi, Jared.
Hi, Jared.
Hi guys. Thank you. Beautiful, such a beautiful chat, and it really resonated with me because I mean, I come from a background of the Ashtanga Vinyasa. I was definitely not a purist. And I also have studied the Gaga technique, and I've auditioned for Basheva and done a lot of work. So you really brought this into my, like, what feels like home territory for me. And therefore I've got some, like, quite, I mean, these are going to be quite prickly questions, I think.
I have to write them.
It's a disclaimer, but that's good. This is good. The one thing is, you know, and this is a little bit in comment on the topic of cultural appropriation, because it's about the theme is, you know, we have this cultural appropriation, you know, to understand what's cultural appreciation and what's cultural appropriation, or when it's a, you know, when it starts to be a destructive force. I think what's happening in academia at the moment is that there's something which I'm very mindful of, is we take ownership of yoga or the theories around yoga, and we base it off sometimes a very limited source. So, you know, we're talking about asana, and I've had this thing, I mean, I'm now doing, I've just finished, you know, my taught portion of the MA yoga meditation. I'm writing my dissertation, but there's such a focus on Pattabhi Joyce's Ashtanga Vinyasa system, the primary series and the secondary series, as if his 6 or so, you know, however you count them, series encapsulate asana practice. And so we study that on the one hand. Then there's a large part of my cohort, which are Iyengar teachers, and they do the same thing, but they're from the Iyengar sphere. They encapsulate yoga in the asana practice in this way, where it's like, you know, we're trying to study the modern, with this modern yoga thing, this phenomenon, which is so broad, but we're looking at it through these tiny little lenses, because this is what we in the West consider to be authentic. Perhaps Sivananda, you know, Satyananda, some of the other, you know, kind of prominent schools are a little bit overlooked, some different insights. And I always wonder, how do their, you know, teachings, how would it shift the research? How would it shift?
Well, I'm going to do a thing I'm slightly uncomfortable doing, which I'm going to ask if you've read my book.
I haven't. It's one of the stack here that I'm busy going through.
Because the entire premise of my research is what is beyond those systems.
Yeah.
And I'm not the only one. By any means. I think you can look to the work of Suzanne Newcomb. You know, Yoga in Britain is a fantastic resource for looking at those kinds of things. I think you can look at my book is post-lineage yoga, but Suzanne Newcomb's book Yoga in Britain is also a fantastic kind of exploration of a kind of different ways of looking at the tradition of yoga that aren't focused on specific lineage systems. There's a fascinating book on Indra Devi, Goddess Pose, which came out, which I can't remember. The author will come back to me.
I have the
It's a good one. I'm sure both Ruth, Laura, and various other people here can think of others. So they do exist, but you might not be coming across them at that taught MA level yet, because they're going to start with the stuff that everyone knows, and that's not the same thing as what academics are researching.
Yeah. But I think that, but don't you think that asks a question? I mean, there's a blind spot there. You know, that's actually what the point I was making. That there's a bit of a blind spot that I mean, you know, and I know I was listening to one of your talks earlier in the year, and you know, there's definitely there's this blind spot, and it's becoming more and more, you know, opened, you know, and especially with people. A friend of mine in the course, Govinda Singh, who's doing, you know, a lot of research in the Sikh yoga tradition. So anyway, it's interesting, but more on your point, Laura. Sorry to go that short. You know, what is interesting about Gaga technique is I wanted to know, you know, really, where do you draw the lines with asana practice? Because, you know, bringing that in and that side of things, and the modern, you know, the modern appreciation for the practical, for kind of that side, which is immensely popular, and you have something like Gaga technique, which I feel is essentially doing, I've always felt it does essentially a similar thing, but it doesn't call itself yoga. It calls itself something else. You know, so would you ever, you know, consider that to be something that, if you looked at it and you compared it, you know, where do you draw the line of asana? What constitutes asana in the modern context, not in the seated, you know, static?
Well, yeah, it's a good and a big question. First of all, I want to mention that what I research is not real lineage yoga, because the people I interviewed, they were informed by so many sources and by such a big surrounding that is a bit different. And I did not go to Mysore and look at the discourse of Sharat Joyce, which I could have done. It was just the project was big enough. So as I said at the beginning, no comparative research, but I think actually that might be becoming more and more that lineage traditions, they call themselves Ashtanga Yoga, but they mingle with so many more contents and so many, for example, modern mindfulness was a huge interpretation scheme, a huge experience filter to modern yoga. And for example, here, modern mindfulness also influences, of course, Gaga. Yeah. So I think in modern practices or 21st century practices, especially those ones my colleague calls neo-spiritual, that are not alluring to spirituality themselves. Like, for spirituality is a big topic in my field, but not in Gaga. It's not like we are spiritual, this is a spiritual practice and so on. So especially in those somehow circles, I think the search is very often similar, and this is why these body categories can be so helpful. My colleague, for example, too, I mean, we worked together like for years next to each other on our researches. One of her main categories for Gaga is flow. One of my main categories for Ashtanga Yoga is flow. So if you have these categories, you can make very well comparisons between the systems without getting essentializing, without saying, well, all is the same today or something. But one can really very well grasp, okay, there is flow in both systems. And like my colleague and I, we really got on a track of doing more like comparative research now on these both things, because it's very fascinating. But there are other things in Gaga, for example, that are not there in Ashtanga Yoga, like improvisation, like float, like let go, and so on. While Ashtanga Yoga is a lot one-pointedness, focus, drishtis, and so, yeah, and this has different psychosomatic effects on the practitioners. So I think this is why it's so helpful to have really look at the body practices, to see what is happening on a body level, to be able to make, to compare them, or also not to compare them.
It makes me think of Osho's dynamic meditation.
Yeah.
In the, you know, when you start thinking of the Gaga side as well, it does have a different result. But the healing is also an interesting thing in Gaga. You know, they also talk about there's this big emphasis that this can heal on various levels.
Sure, you can.
Yeah. It's very beautiful.
Thanks for your question. Yeah.
we should move on. I'm aware of the time. And I also want to really second your point about more comparative research, please. Definitely, I think there's some really fantastic and fascinating things that we can do when we start to be in conversation with dance studies researchers and other kinds of movement researchers as well. And I know that, I'm sure it's the same for you, a lot of my references came from that field as well. Some of them are really interesting kind of articles and research out there. So I have a different question for you, which hopefully is easier to answer, which is, you've mentioned this article, you've mentioned your book, and it'll be out, and I know it's in German, but could you tell us, if you tell us the title, at least some people will be able to read it, so that we know when's it coming out, what's it called.
Title is still under construction. I now got a scholarship for it's much too long, but it's called Wie ein Text zur Praxis wird, like how a text becomes practice. That's for sure the main title, and then I have to deal a bit with Ashtanga yoga and blah blah blah, how I make all the details firm and tight and interesting. And I got a scholarship now for publishing it, and because in Germany it's a very difficult thing to publish a PhD. And so I will have some coaching and some nice input in the next month. But they still told me, even if this is now all very tightly scheduled, I mean, I just finished my PhD 3 months ago, so tightly scheduled, even then they informed me that it might be the beginning of 2022. We're
used to those schedules. I mean, when it is out, it would be and when you're over that hurdle, it'd be lovely to come back and celebrate it. If you want to do that, I'm sure we can find someone who can read German. It's not one of my languages, sadly, which was a shame.